Hello and welcome. The Wire, along with four other media partners, has just published an investigation led by the Europe based Lighthouse Reports that shows that investors are speculating on food and that is contributing to skyrocketing food prices all around the world. You've probably noticed in the last several months that your grocery bills have gone up. The cost of food has increased. The reason you're told is Russia's war in Ukraine and how that will impact key supply chains with both Russia and Ukraine being major producers and exporters of agricultural commodities. Well, that's not the full story, as our investigation has found. To talk about the investigation and its findings, I have with me Thin Le Vin, who is a Rome-based independent journalist and was one of the lead investigators on this project called Lighthouse Reports. Welcome, Thin. Let's start by talking very
Thanks for
broadly.
having me, Kabir.
Thanks for agreeing and thanks for your time. Shall we start by talking about very broadly on what the findings of the investigation are?
Sure. I guess, in a nutshell, what we were trying to do was to find out, if there's anybody that could be profiting from hunger. Like you said, right, the grocery bills for pretty much everybody around the world has been rising. And we know that the prices have been rising even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that's, a combination of factors that include, the COVID-19 pandemic, the supply chain crunch, some of the demand coming back, as well as climate pressures. And of course, everybody said that what's happening in Ukraine is going to exacerbate all these food price rises. But we also wanted to know if there were anybody that might be sort of taking advantage of the situation and engaging in bad behavior. And part of this is because in 2007, 2008 food price crisis, which was also really quite terrible for a lot of people. In fact, some statistics show that about 40 million people, fell into hunger as a result of that crisis. And there was a lot of experts have said that excessive speculation played a role in pushing up prices even further during that time. So we wanted to see if something like that was happening again. And as you know, like you just said, and you were part of the investigation as well, Kabir, we found that investors have been flocking into agricultural index funds since the war started.
Yeah, and I mean we've also found that this has perhaps been happening in certain markets, like in the Paris wheat market. This has been happening for a while. So the interest of the speculators, which are the investment funds, investment firms, other funds as well, has increased in the wheat futures contract. So which points to speculation, because they are not interested in wheat, they are not interested in the commodity, right? So their only purpose is to make profit out of rising prices. So essentially, they are betting on the rising price of wheat, if the case is wheat. And like as one of the people who commented on our story said, that they are betting on hunger. They're betting on people going hungry, because that is what it would mean, because that is what we are seeing now, like with countries like Lebanon, who are major food importers, who rely on imports from countries for essentials like wheat. They are struggling. And part of the reason also why the situation is so bad this time is also because there's an economic crisis right across the world, which has been ongoing since the beginning of the pandemic. So the currencies are devalued, so they have to pay more in their own currency to import food. So people are really struggling. And there was a UN report just out, I think 2 days ago, which noted that people who are facing acute hunger has gone up by about 40 million in the last year alone, and this is before the war began, right? I mean, one can only imagine what the situation would be right now. So also generally, what are some of the markets that we were looking at? How did you begin investigating this?
So, we looked at what is currently happening in commodity funds, and whether, are we seeing speculators coming in again, in the past couple of months since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine began. And we particularly looked at two major exchanges, Kabir, as you know yourself, the Chicago exchange, and also in Europe, Paris, the Euronext. So, these are two of the largest agricultural commodity exchanges in the world. And we looked particularly at wheat because, Russia and Ukraine together account for about a quarter to 30% of global wheat exports. Here, I think we should emphasize that we're talking about exports, not production. Only a small percentage of wheat that is produced globally is actually exported, but they still play a pretty important role. And for import-dependent countries like Lebanon, you just mentioned, and like countries like Egypt, that relies on wheat. They eat bread every day, right? It's a major staple, and that rely on these countries to bring in wheat to feed their people. That will have a big impact. So a lot of talk was about how the impact on supply will have an impact on the price. But when we looked at these inflows into these commodity funds, and also when we looked at the cereal production levels, right now, as well as going back as far as 15 years, we saw that production levels have not actually declined significantly. In fact, they've stayed steady and climbed slowly, but climbed steadily. So, we know that physical supply is there. We know that there are no global food shortages, at least not right at this point in time. And yet, when we look at the price volatility, there were so many spikes going on, and in a way it proved to us that what is happening in the markets in terms of price have very little to do with the fundamentals of supply and demand.
And that's the problem here, right? Because the futures market, while it's important for farmers and also for food security, because it's a price discovery mechanism in theory, that is the purpose it should serve. And also it also amounts to the ability to store and a certain degree of certainty for farmers that if you are sowing now, there is a buyer in the future who will buy your produce. But what we see, unfortunately, is that these markets are also functioning as any other equities market would, right? If people are only betting on that, okay, so this is the news that is coming in, that Russia has invaded Ukraine, which means that there will be concern around the supply of wheat or the export of wheat, which means that the price will go up. Let's put money into wheat. This is what essentially seems to be happening, and this is what one of the fund managers even mentioned in a blog, right? That this is expected to happen. He mentioned that while this may negatively impact food security, but it's a good time for you to make money on wheat. So, and investors have been doing that, and which is, it's part of the reason there is a legitimate concern around the supply of wheat as well. Although the latest forecasts by the UN also show that the production itself of both cereals and wheat is not going to decline that much for this year. And the wheat production will actually increase slightly. But experts have pointed that there could be a problem in the season after that, especially because of the fertilizer prices and many countries perhaps not being able to use fertilizers as much as they would have wanted to. So there is definitely concern, but what our investigation has shown that that's not the only reason. There is significant interest and speculative activity which has pushed up prices, and that's crucial, right? And how do you think that augurs in the current scenario? 2 years of COVID, then this war, and food security going, from bad to worse in almost all parts of the developing world.
You're absolutely right, Kabir, and I think it's worth again stressing that point that the situation was already bad, And yes, there are legitimate reasons as to why speculation should happen. Like you said, right? I mean, it provides liquidity to the market. It helps, farmers and buyers to hedge themselves. It plays a useful role. I think with this investigation, what we were trying to discover was whether there was excessive speculation happening. So this is speculation that goes beyond, what is normal to keep a market buoyant, right? That goes beyond the fundamental the market fundamentals of supply and demand. And what we also discovered was that the commodity markets are really quite opaque. So it's really quite hard to find, information. We've relied quite a lot on publicly available data. We also use freedom of information requests to find out some of things. And despite those challenges, what we found was really quite worrying. If you would just let me, briefly talk about some numbers. So what we found was that $4.5 billion actually flowed into these what we call commodity linked exchange traded funds, so funds that are publicly listed in the first week of March. Normally, that amount of money, it takes a whole month to come in. And yet now only in just 1 week, this amount of investment money that has come in. In fact, two top agricultural funds, Invesco's Agriculture Fund and Tukurium's Wheat Fund, they attracted a net investment of 1.2 billion. I want to repeat this again, 1.2 billion. That compared to 197 million for the whole of 2021. And I think that in itself shows, the huge influx and interest of investors coming in. And these are people who...
In other words, there was an increase of 10 times over the whole of 2021 in just the first 3 months of 2022.
Yeah, exactly. And, and I think, again, it's important to point out that these are investors that actually do not have anything to do with the actual production and trade of the grains of wheat, right? All the supply, absolutely, yeah. All the supply of it. They are just in it because they see that prices are rising and could rise further and could profit from it.
Correct. So yeah, it's very much like people who invest in stock markets would probably relate to this, that you often see certain scripts and certain companies which are not backed by fundamentals, but their prices continue to rise and there is no logical explanation. And that is pretty much partly what is happening in the case of food as well. And especially with these two funds that you mentioned, like I remember from the data that there was this one day of March 7 where they got an inflow of more money than they do in an entire year, just on one day.
Yeah.
So something was definitely happening and something was definitely going on. And there was continues to be this expectation that the prices will increase, and which is why this speculative activity goes on. Why is it wrong? Right? What are the downsides to this? Why should it not happen? Why is it not legitimate?
So I think we've already sort of established that, there is a legitimate role for speculators to play. The concern with excessive speculation is that is going to contribute to food prices getting higher and higher and higher. And that is going to have a devastating impact on particularly poor households in many countries around the world, regardless of whether you're in a developed or developing nation. If you are a poor household, you are likely to spend a large percentage of your income on food. So even if food prices rise by, 5%, 10%, if you're already spending half of your income or more on food, that's a big impact. on your disposable income. Of course, the effect is going to be even harder for poor households in poor countries. I mean, the World Bank has actually estimated that 1 percentage point increase in food prices could throw 10 million people into extreme poverty. This is coming on top of figures that have shown that food security is rising again, partly because of COVID-19, because of conflicts, because of climate change. I mean, in 2020, 1 out of 3 people around the world, that's 2.3, almost 2.4 billion people around the world, do not have access to adequate food. And we're talking about food prices in some countries that have risen by 50%, 70%. I mean, to many families, that is going to mean either they cut the amount of food that they eat, or they eat lower quality food. In many cases, they're probably going to do both. They're going to eat just 2 meals out of 3 or 1, and they're going to focus a lot more on staples like bread, which of course, wheat is a key ingredient, and eat less nutritious fruits and vegetables, which tend to be more expensive. In short, we're going to have millions more people who will go into hunger, who will fall into hunger. And, a lot of governments remember, I'm sure, Kabir, you might remember as well, during the Arab Spring, there were food prices were a contributor, right? In Tunisia, when there were protests happening, there were all these food riots. I think people remember 2007, 2008, 2011. Governments and experts and aid agencies, they're worried about unrest and hunger and the needs, but also there's this much longer term impact. When you are unable to have adequate food for a prolonged period of time, you're going to develop micronutrient deficiencies. You're going to become malnourished. And, that is a health problem that you can pass down from one generation to another. And it doesn't just affect your physical well-being, but your cognitive well-being. And ultimately, it will have an impact on a country's GDP, economic level, and productivity. So we're talking about far-reaching consequences that are just beyond a single household or a single country even.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that it's not only the food importing countries who would suffer, but also, I mean, we see this in India as well. I mean, India is not a food importing country. In fact, India has been trying to export wheat. Yet, food inflation in India has been picking up because the price of wheat has gone up. So it impacts what happens in the market, impacts everyone around the world. So we are in India, we are in a situation that we say that we are wheat surplus, food surplus in grains, yet we have the largest population of hungry people in the world. And this has been growing since COVID because of the loss of incomes due to COVID. And I mean, that's been growing despite India having a very efficient public distribution system. So, I mean, a recent survey pointed out that at least 80% of people reported a degree of food insecurity of those surveyed. So those are severe consequences. And this is happening. I mean, India is not a food importing country. So one would think that higher prices of wheat in the global market would not impact India, but it impacts everyone. And it impacts, and it will impact the poorest the most. Right. So we already have a situation where the poor are suffering due to COVID and then loss of incomes because of that. The poor people, most poor people cannot work from home, so they don't have the luxury. They don't have the luxury of doing that, right? So already suffering. Then on top of that, this crisis now, which is already here, but it could get much worse in the coming months, right?
Exactly, and quite a lot of the experts that we've spoken to have also raised concerns that things could get worse. I mean, and they are already raising concerns of, about excessive speculation and what should be done. And I think it's really important to point out that this could have been prevented to a certain extent. Now, obviously, climate pressures are having a massive impact on food production. There's drought in the Horn of Africa, and droughts in other parts of major food producing regions have had an impact. So, and then of course, the war in Ukraine has had an impact. So food prices were bound to go up just because of the different pressures around it. But excessive speculation and its contribution to food price spikes could have been prevented because there were attempts, in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 food price crisis to sort of bring in more stricter regulations to rein in some of that behavior. Unfortunately, that didn't work because of industry lobbying, and some of the rules were watered down just in the past couple of years. And that has allowed excessive speculation to happen yet again. This is the third food price crisis in 15 years. This particular aspect of it, the excessive speculation, could have been stopped, could have been prevented. And it still, in a way, could be done, right? To sort of stop the war in Ukraine or to sort of tackle some of the climate pressures requires a lot more, perhaps, resources and work. Whereas putting in things like position limits. Now, position limits are limits on the number of contracts that a single investor can hold. So putting in position limits on making all these transactions much more transparent and accountable. These things are in the arsenal of governments. They can do this right now, and they could have prevented it, and they could, if they want to do something about it, they could prevent it from worsening. And I think that's the tragedy of it, that it wasn't done, and it doesn't look like it is happening anytime soon. Our hope is that the investigation will sort of push, provide some of the push for policymakers to actually really look into this, and then see curbing excessive speculation as one of the tools that they can use.
Right, but what are the pitfalls here? Like you mentioned, regulation was one of the things that came out of the 2008-11 crisis. There were attempts to regulate these markets in the way they function. Can you expand a little bit on the lobbying, etc., which led to some deregulation once again, and which perhaps contributed to the situation?
Yeah, so what we discovered through documents that we have access to, as well as publicly available records, what we discovered was that in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 food price crisis, there was a concerted push, by a lot of civil society and aid agencies to rein in speculative behavior, what they call the financialization of commodities. And their argument was that food is not just like any other commodity. It's a basic necessity. It is integral to our human beings' existence, and therefore they should be regulated slightly differently. And the people should be a lot more conservative when it comes to trading on food and commodities. So there was this push, and there was a political will, actually, both in the US and the EU. And in the EU, the French were really pushing for it to bring in new laws and rules. So the Dodd-Frank Act in the US, was a part of that. It was a response to the subprime crisis and all the financial issues, and they tried to put in position limits. In the EU as well, they did something similar, and they brought in new rules, and again tried to put these position limits in. Unfortunately, what happened was that in the US, when the CFTC tried to put those limits, industry lobby groups, two groups, immediately sued the CFTC. Yeah, that's the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which is the government regulator on the futures market. They sued, and that delayed the implementation of these new rules by many, many years. In Europe, we spoke to the civil society who were involved in some of those campaigning, and they said that they were really, really happy, and they were so relieved that politicians were listening and agreed with them. And yet we also saw through the documents that a lot of the industry lobby groups with banks, big major international banks, really lobbied the EU to not put strict position limits. And in the end, when the position limits either came into being or when the actual rules were passed, they were a lot more weaker than they could have been and should have been. And what has happened since then, in the past 2 or 3 years, was that some of those weak rules were relaxed even further, which meant that people said, oh, the position limits that were set were too high. Well, they were raised even further, or they were lifted, which meant that speculation could continue almost unabated. Instead of learning from that crisis, almost the reverse has happened. And of course, it's the poor people, the poor households in developing countries who are having to pay for it.
And they will continue to have to pay for it for a while to come, right? Even the World Food Program has said, which is one of the major, also buys a lot of wheat. So even they have had to ration down on their supplies in some of the countries which are suffering the worst food insecurity in the world, right? And these are countries in Africa, Afghanistan. And we also see that this year there is, like you mentioned, the drought in the Horn of Africa and the early summer heat wave in India. So with climate change, these problems are going to increase. So we will perhaps see a situation right now. We don't so far see an actual physical shortfall of food, but it's likely that we will see that in the future because of climate change, and climate change is only going to get worse. Right, so the situation will get worse. So when we see those kind of physical shortfalls happen, and because of the way these markets are structured and the way the speculators operate, so the price rises will be even more when there are physical shortfalls. When we see the situation right now, when there is only an expectation of a shortfall, which is probably not based entirely in fact either. But when it actually happens, then one can imagine what the price of wheat is going to be. If it is continued to be traded like any other equity stock. But I mean, we don't eat equity stocks. Human beings don't need them. So it doesn't matter. But with wheat, it actually physically matters to the poorest of the poor. How do you see the situation in the next few months?
I think, I'm not an expert in terms of when it comes to the commodity markets or food production. I'm just a journalist that is passionate about these topics. But the experts that we have spoken to have said, I think, a couple of things. One is that the situation could worsen. In a way that you have just explained. At the moment, global supplies are fine, stock to use ratios are fine, but if the war is prolonged and if climate pressures get worse, and because of the fertilizer, prices rising, at the moment, rice, there hasn't been a massive impact on rice, right? The concern is that by the next harvest season, if fertilizer prices are still out of reach, it's very expensive, then it could have an impact on rice as well. And then we're talking about billions more of people that depend on rice as a staple, who will now face sudden spikes in price of rice, and then maybe unable to afford it. So a lot of experts that we've spoken to are really worried about the future. And a lot of experts, but also what they have said is that it's not, despite the grim scenario in the future, there is still time to do something about it. There are things that we could do, for example, supporting agencies like the World Food Program that you just mentioned, right? The UN Food Aid Agency, who said there are seeing a massive increase in their operational costs because of the food price crisis. I mean, I was talking to an aid worker from the Norwegian Refugee Council who works with the WFP, who said that, they're seeing 30 to 50% less food for the amount of
Wow.
money that they use to buy food compared to a year ago. So imagine if the prices go further, right? So governments can do multiple things. One is to continue supporting aid agencies, set up their own social protection programs so that they can help the vulnerable people in their countries to make sure that they don't run out of food, that they still have access to food, right? I mean, a lot of the times when we talk about hunger and food insecurity, it's not because there isn't availability, it's access, and a lot of it is political decisions. So that needs to change. And third, trading of food should be regulated in a completely different manner, again, because it is essential to our existence. And it shouldn't be treated in the same way as other commodities, right? And so, the future is bleak, but there are things that can be done. And I guess one last point that I just want to add, one of the experts that we were speaking to was also saying how, that one of the debates over regulating the financial markets was because there isn't a scientific consensus as to whether excessive speculation is playing a role or is contributing to it. And in fact, in the post 2007-2008 situation where France was really pushing, and some of the other import dependent countries were really pushing for stricter regulation, a lot of the other countries pushed back to say, well, there isn't a consensus that excessive speculation caused this, so we shouldn't do anything. But an expert that we spoke to, a researcher from the University of Bonn, would say, hang on a minute, we are talking about food here, and we're talking about food security globally that will affect billions of people. And therefore, scientific consent, we can't just wait for scientific consensus, or that scientific consensus shouldn't be to show that there is speculation definitely happening. It should be the other way around. What should be proven is that excessive speculation isn't happening. Right. Unless you can prove that, you should take the precautionary principle and protect people's lives and livelihoods.
Correct. Let's hope that happens, and that this investigation shines a light on all of this and opens the eyes of people, particularly those in power who can make these regulatory changes. Thanks for joining, Tin. It was great talking to you. And please read the story. It's up on the Wire website. You can also find it at Der Spiegel, Follow the Money, and The Continent. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me, Kabir.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else, for channel members only. Memberships start at ₹89. Hit the join button below.